Presenting the history of Wano Kuni. Once upon a time, there was a land with samurai. And then a bunch of stuff happened. And then one of those samurai sliced a giant dragon in half. And then more stuff happened. And then there was a man named Odin. He was pretty cool. And then a giant dragon duckfish appeared. The end. Oh, and also, I am Lord Orochi! He was there too. Lord Orochi was there too. And then he got his head cut off, and then now we're pretty much, that brings you up to speed. Alright, so, there is a lot of stuff that Oda likes to just throw into the background, sometimes in maybe data books or SBSs. You know, Oda comes out a lot of times and says, you know, I wanted to do this thing, or I wanted to expand on this thing, but I just didn't have the time for it, you know, or it might have slowed the story down is a better way of describing that. Like the whole Shimosuke Kozaburo thing, you know, the story of the swordsmith that left Wano like 55 years ago. This was well before Odin's flashback even began 41 years ago, and so he went to the East Blue and he started up a village. Like, I find that kind of stuff extraordinarily interesting, right? Like, if you want to do a whole little mini arc and take a few chapters out of the story, like, I would be perfectly fine with that, Oda. But I understand his perspective, you know, because I think Oda understands, like, how he writes, you know, more than anybody, and he's like, maybe if I start with this story, I'll get off into a tangent, and then other people want to know what's going on in the war with Onigashima and everything like that, so I should probably, if I am going to reference that, it should only be in like an SBS, or maybe I'll reference that at the very end of the arc after all the fighting is over. We might cut over to Shimosuke Village in the east, we see Kozaburo there, who's Kuina's father and Zoro's mentor, and then we might even see, Koshiro, sorry, Koshiro was Zoro and Kuina's mentor, and then Kozaburo, who's Koshiro's father, and he's like maybe this old man living in the village, and maybe he like looks up to the sky and he's like, it seems Wano is finally liberated. You know, maybe we might get something like that, okay? But the point is, there is a lot of stuff that connects to Wano that we haven't even found out about yet, even in Odin's flashback, okay? Odin's flashback, because of the whole time travel shenanigans, that starts 41 years prior to the current storyline in the story. The current storyline in the story, yes, okay? So this is before the God Valley incident and everything happened 41 years ago. That's when Odin was 18 years old. That's when his father, Sukiyake, like, excommunicated him from the family, and he fought the mountain god and everything like that 41 years ago. And then we go throughout his exploits, you know, traveling around Wano, defeating Ashura Doji, unifying Curry, becoming the daimyo of Curry, being welcomed back into the Kozuki family, having his scabbards. His scabbards began to learn and understand through the tutelage of Yasuie, and then 30 years ago he encounters Whitebeard and goes out to sea with Whitebeard, and then he meets Toki, and then he keeps traveling, and then they encounter Roger, and he travels with Roger, and he comes back, and he dances in the street, and then there's Kaido there and everything, and Orochi, and then the death of Odin, and all that stuff, right? And that only brings us to 20 years ago, right? So, I think we already know that kind of stuff, because there was a whole flashback arc about that, and it's in the anime right now, so go check that out. But I want to go through sort of a timeline of all those little pieces of information that we found out about Wano that may or may not connect back, but it really helps to establish Wano is an old country in One Piece, okay? The history of Wano doesn't just stretch back 100 years or so, it stretches back well beyond the Void Century. Like, well before the Void Century, there was a Wano, okay? So let's just start with that, alright? And of course, we don't have numbers for a lot of these things. Some of them we do. Like, we know 41 years ago is with Odin's flashback, 55 years ago Kozaburo left, we know 400 years ago, roughly, is when Ryuma slayed the dragon, but we don't have a lot of dates for all this stuff. But let me just go back, okay? So I want to start even before the Void Century here, because a few things have been mentioned about that. It was stated that Wano, even though it's been isolated since the Void Century, it's been isolated for about 800 years, it wasn't always like that. At one point, Odin stated, after he found out the true history and everything, and also learning stuff about the Kozuki family, yeah, Wano was actually at one point connected to the rest of the world, just like every other nation, alright? And for some reason, there was some great power that showed up. I can't imagine what that would be. Might be the world government, not really sure, but yes, of course. The world government showed up, the Void Century happened, and then after that great war, or whatever the world government did there, and when the 20 kings came together, Wano was basically, the Kozuki clan specifically was like, okay, we're closing our borders, we will have none of this in the outside world, we have no idea what the world government's going to get up to or what they're going to establish, but we're going to be separate separate from everything. We're going to be closed off. Anybody that comes into the country, we will immediately, like annihilate, slaughter, and then no one's allowed to leave the country either, okay? And so that policy of isolationism is, parallel to the policy of isolationism during the Edo period, when the Tokugawa shogunate ruled over everything, okay? They were isolated for about 250 years until the arrival of the black ships in the 1850s, right? And so that's parallel to that, just it took a lot longer in the One Piece world. Wano was isolated for like 800 years in this regard, right? But what about before this? What about when it was connected to the rest of the world? What was it like then? I find it very interesting. Of course, the world government is extremely, preoccupied with limiting information about the Void Century. Anything that involves, the Void Century, they have to limit. But what happened before the Void Century would also be very detrimental, right? Like, if the people found out what the world was like 1,000 years ago, that was well before the Void Century happened. But I still think, if you read about what the world was like 1,000 years ago, that would kind of give you an idea of what the world was like during the Void Century and what the world government did to change it. You know what I mean? So, for example, like, let's say I'm gonna go with my theory that maybe the world was very technologically advanced at one point, right? And so they had, like, I don't know, airships and, like, advanced laser technology. Okay, maybe not like that. But it certainly was maybe a lot more technologically advanced than it was now. And so if you read history about, like, 1,100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, and it's like, oh, that's what the world was like, so I guess the Void Century happened. So I think the world government is interested in any piece of information that would occur, before the Void Century ever happened, okay? After the Void Century, they kind of had control over everything, but before all that, it's just like, we want to limit that information, right? And so there's probably very little surviving documents of that period as well. One of the only times it's ever been referenced is when Robin was at Skypiea, and she was reading all of the different ruins in the kingdom of Shandora, and it was like, 1,100 years ago, the kingdom of Shandora was built, and it prospers, and it was like 800 something years ago, right at the end of the Void Century, that the great golden city of Shandora fell. Keep in mind that when we discovered Shandora with Nolan's flashback, that was about 400 years ago as well. Interesting. Nolan lived around the same time that Ryuma slayed a giant dragon. I wonder if Nolan and Ryuma ever met each other. That's actually kind of interesting. At any rate, the point is, when we meet Kalgara and everybody at that point in the tribe of Shandorians, the City of Gold is in ruins. Like, it's still there, and people are still living there, but it was not at the height of power that it used to be, okay? Now, why is Shandora important? Why am I bringing this up? Well, this is something that was, I think, only mentioned a single time as just a side note sort of thing, but it was mentioned that Wano used to be called the Country of Gold. Okay? Now, when was it called the Country of Gold? When did that fall out of vogue? We don't know. I like to think it's just a legend that was passed down through some of the books, like, and it's just, that's all it is. It's like one sentence that's like, Wano Kuni used to be called the Country of Gold. Keen. And then that's it. And so people are like, oh, I guess it used to be called the Country of Gold. Wouldn't it be interesting if before the Void Century, it was called the Country of Gold way, way, way back in its, like, earliest days, because they mined a lot of gold there. Shandora was also the City of Gold, and on top of that, it was stated Wano used to be connected to the rest of the world. So, who knows, maybe way back in the day, Wano and the Golden City of Shandora, I know they're on opposite sides of the planet, although there's the whole theory involving Wano being towed into existence by a bunch of ancient giants, because the islands don't look like they fit together. They look like they were grabbed from various locations and slammed together to make a country. So wouldn't it be interesting if it maybe, like, the core of Wano, what would later be moved to become Wano Kuni in the New World? Maybe it was closer to Shandora. We're talking about stuff that would have happened, like, over 1,000 years ago and everything like that. Now, I know that in our world we have, like, plate tectonics and, the mantle and the continents can shift. That takes a lot of time. That takes like millions of years, but this is anime we're talking about here. So this is anime where we could have a giant freaking a geyser underneath the ocean that can launch an entire island into the sky, which also has a sea that could support island life. So, the idea that in 1,000 years, Wano was closer to Shandora and then it ended up on the other side of the world somehow because of plate tectonics or because giants moved it, I'm okay with either of those. knows, you know, like, it makes sense. At any rate, or maybe the whole theory that, like, if the red line wasn't even there back then, if the red line was created by the world government, there might have not have been this massive barrier. That would have made things a lot easier to drift around, right? You know, volcanic eruptions, knock-up streams, giants, you know, moving stuff around. The world was chaotic back then, right? Okay, so I'm just saying, it used to be called the Country of Gold. We have no idea what that reference is, but it seems to mention, like, they say it as sort of just like, oh yeah, that was way back. I don't know the exact year, but yeah, it used to be called the Country of Gold way back in the day. So there we go. I also want to take a moment to talk about the different things that Wano mines, like their resources, because it's actually quite interesting. So they have gold, but they also have silver and copper, because that's just like their currency systems. Platinum, they have the platinum pieces, okay, so they have those. But on top of that, they also have sea stone that is mined there. You know, for a reference of sea stone, here's a picture of sea stone cuffs with Robin's butt in the background. Hey, this was the picture they used on the wiki, so there you go. But at any rate, they have sea stone, which is mined there. It was stated that it has like the largest deposits of sea stone, or rather, the origin of sea stone all over the world comes from Wano. Now, there is sea stone in like other parts of the ocean, like maybe little veins of it underwater or on the bottom of the ocean, because the whole existence of Sky Islands is because of a chemical called pyrobrine that exists inside of sea prism stone, and when that evaporates with the water cycle, that's what condenses and makes island clouds. So for there to be island clouds all over the world, that stands to reason there has to be sea prism stone in the water all over the world as well. But the origin of that ore probably comes from Wano. And the idea that the entire country is raised up like a plateau, you know, kind of lends to that belief. Like that whole plateau there could just be one solid like mine of sea prism, okay? And on top of that, which may connect back to the sea prism, is the ponoglyphs. Ponoglyphs are also created there, which is another type of stone. Is it another type of stone, or is it sea prism? Or is it sea prism combined with another kind of ore, just like how you combine like ores in our world, like you take tin and copper and you make bronze? Maybe it's like you take the raw ponoglyph, whatever, like, well, you take the raw sea prism and maybe another kind of ore or something like iron or something, and it's a type of metallurgy, a type of like smithing that only exists in Wano because they're the experts on it, and they take these ores and put them together, and that's how they mold and create these unbreakable stones called ponoglyphs. Considering sea prism stone is one of the most like unbreakable materials in the entire world of One Piece, like it's always talked about, like it's really hard to break sea prism, like it's impossible, it's harder than diamond. Considering that's stated, and also ponoglyphs are also stated to be unbreakable, like the connection there is not lost on me. Now the issue with that is like we've had moments where Robin, who is a devil fruit user, you know, touches the ponoglyphs to like read them, and she doesn't seem like she has any of the ill effects of sea prism, but that could be the thing. Like it's not completely 100% sea prism. It's sea prism mixed with other ore to create the cubes, okay? And so she can touch it and look through it, and a devil fruit user really wouldn't be weakened by that, or it would be very negligible if she was weakened. She would barely even, you know, detect it, but overall it's still like that extreme like hardness, like it can't be destroyed. So Wano's got gold, silver, copper, platinum, sea stone, and whatever the hell ponoglyphs are made out of, okay? So it's got a lot of really valuable resources there. Probably just another reason why the world government would want it, and that's why the CP0 are there and everything like that. So then we get the Void Sentry. This is all just backup stuff. This is just stuff that existed prior to the Void Sentry, like prehistory in the One Piece world, okay? But we got all that. And then we have the Void Sentry, and we know very, very little about the Void Sentry, even though, hey, I'll tell Oda, I'll give him credit there. I mean, hey, he did not give us too much information about the Void Sentry, so it's like, ah, man, 1,000 chapters in the story, the Void Sentry, we already know about a bunch of stuff that happens. No, we really don't. We know the Noah and Poseidon are involved there. We know the world government came to power. We know Joy Boy did some stuff. And the other thing that was added just recently in this arc is we know about Toki. Toki Amasuki was born approximately 830 years ago, which would have put it closer to the tail end of the Void Century. The Void Century began 900 years ago, ended 800 years ago with the world government and the 20 kings emerging as the rulers of the world. Approximately 830 years ago, that's when Toki was born, and we know very, very little about her history. How did she consume the time fruit? Under what circumstances did she get sent into the future? Was she given a task by her, you know, her parents or the other members of the Amasuki family? family or the Kozuki family. Was the Kozuki family the shoguns back then? We know that they existed back then, but we don't know if they were the shogun. It could have been a thing where maybe the Yamasuki clan were the ruling factor, and then the Kozukis wanted isolationism, and the Yamasuki didn't, and they, you know, got into a fight, and then the Kozukis won, and then they became the new shoguns, and then they instituted the isolationism. There's sort of this underlying idea that Odin sort of spoke about when he returned after his journey with Roger, that the Kozukis way back in the day might have actually been the bad guys. They might have been like the Tokugawa shogunate, like that took over Japan and closed it off for 250 years, right? They might have been like that, you know? And so the Amasuki clan still continues, well, maybe not to this day, because Orochi took care of all the daimyos and he ruled over Wano with an iron fist. But at least at the time when Orochi was still working in Sukiyaki's court and he was still planning everything, you had Kozuki Odin, who had left at that point, but he was the daimyo of the Kuri region, and then you had the Shimosuke, the Uzuki, the Fugetsu, and the Amasuki. So they still existed, and we'll get to the Kurozumis later because that's Orochi's family. That doesn't happen until way later, though. Way later, like 40-something years ago in the story does that happen, okay? There's a lot of stuff to unpack here, okay? But we're still talking about Toki. Point is, Toki Amasuki, the Amasuki clan existed back then, and it still exists, you know, at least, you know, right before Orochi did his nefarious deeds, it was still in Wano, okay? So there might have been a power struggle over the years. The family that could have been the shogun, the ruling class, might have shifted many times throughout the course of Wano's history, but eventually the Kozukis took over, isolated everything, and then they maintained that power for over 800 years as the Kozuki clan was the shogun of Wano. All right, so does that make sense? Okay. Is Toki the mysterious figure that we saw in the last chapter? Boy, I hope so, if nothing else, just for the fact that she's still alive and she can maybe shed some light on the crazy stuff going on here. When she time jumped, she somehow ended outside of Wano, and that might have been because of the time jumping, or that might have been because, like, maybe they put her on a boat, like, when the world government was taking over and the Kozukis were, like, closing off the borders. They were like, Toki, you need to leave the country, get out of here, use your magical time powers, and then you need to come back someday and you have a task you need to fulfill. And Toki's like, okay, I'll do that. And then so she leaves, and then she hops through time, you know, multiple times. She doesn't jump immediately 800 years in the future. She makes a few different time jumps, probably encounters a lot of problems every time she jumps, and then finally she ran into Odin, and then Whitebeard, and then finally she runs into Odin, and then Whitebeard, and then she's like, okay, I need to go back to Wano, I need to finish my destiny, like my prophecy that needs to be fulfilled or whatever, and so eventually she ends up back in Wano, but we don't even, it's never really referenced exactly what she was supposed to do, or why did she want to go back to Wano. That was never referenced in the flashback. So they drop her off after she starts feeling sick, and then we don't really get much more of that. Like, she rallies the people of Kuri to believe in Odin, you know, even though he left, he's out there doing a journey. She takes an arrow in the leg, you know, and she raises Momo and Hiyori, and she's very nice, and everybody loves her, but we don't really get the idea of, like, why did she have to go back to Wano? What was the big prophecy that took 800 years of time jumping in order to arrive at, you know? And then she gives the prophecy that, like, oh, the scabbards will return one day to defeat Kaido, but that doesn't seem like the prophecy that would have existed 800 years ago. That seems like something just recent, you know? Like, oh, Kaido's taking over, I'm gonna send the scabbards into the future, they will return one day and they will save us all. You know, that's something more recent. You know, what was the reason why she wanted to go to Wano to begin with? You know, what was her destiny, right? So I'm hoping Toki is still alive just so she can explain more of that stuff. But that was approximately 830 years ago she was born, and so maybe it was more in the, I think she's like in her 20s or in her 30s, so it would have been like in the 890s. It would have been right at the tail end of the Void Century, you know, when she made the jump and when she left, okay, and where she was given her mission. So now we have, oh, one more thing before we go into the future, the Kitetsu line. That's something else important to bring up. So we know right now Tenguyama Hitetsu was the creator of the Sandai, the third generation Kitetsu. And he's a pretty old dude right now. I would assume he's probably like the same age as like Kozaburo. So Tenguyama right now is probably like in his 70s or 80s. Like, he's a pretty old Tengu living out in the middle of Amagasa village, okay? He created the Sandai. He mentions that his ancestor Kotetsu created created the Nidai Kotetsu, the second generation. We have no idea when Kotetsu lived. It was generations ago, most likely. And then the ancestor of Kotetsu and Hitetsu was Kitetsu, the original creator of the first generation Shodai Kotetsu. So we have no idea where the timelines is on this. We do know it's at least not a progressive, like, grandfather, father, grandson kind of thing. Where, like, Tenguyama is the son of Kotetsu, who is the son of Kitetsu. That's not how it works. It's generations in the making. But it could stretch back 400 years ago to Ryuma's time, or it could stretch back maybe as far as the Void Century, or hell, even further back than that, where these Kotetsu blades, these famed curse blades brought into the world existed. I would imagine it probably happened a long time ago for the legend to really gather as much steam as it really has, but there's only 3 in existence, so they're probably spread out. Maybe it's like, he created the Sandai in the current storyline, Tenguyama, during his lifetime, and then maybe the Nidai was created, maybe, I don't know, a few hundred years ago during Ryuma's time, and then during the Void Century, that's when Kitetsu lived and then created the Shodai, maybe. But that's another thing that ties into the timeline of Wano. They were all forged there. Probably all of the major Meito grades, maybe not every single Meito. We know some of them, like Cavendish's Durandal, is a completely different style. That was made in another nation. But at least maybe like the higher tiered ones, like the Saijos and stuff, might have been all made in Wano. So I wanted to bring that up. Is there anything else immediately until we jump to Ryuma? I don't think there is. Okay. So Ryuma happened 400 years ago. That's when he lived. He was, Frost Moon. He had the Shimosuke title. It's possible his last name was Shimosuke, so Ryuma Shimosuke, or Shimosuke just meaning Frost Moon could very well mean that was his nickname, and then the Shimosuke family took that title from him from that day onward as respect for Ryuma, like he was the founder of their clan. Either one, I think, really works there. A great dragon attacked the flower capital. Ryuma was said to, arrive, and then he sliced it down, and that's how he got the title of Sword God and his great Owazamono Shusui, and he was laid to rest in the Ringo region, which is where he was born, and Shusui was laid there until it was eventually robbed by Gecko Moria, hundreds of years later. So, of course, he comes from monsters, and I did a whole video on, a retrospective involving Ryuma, so go check that out there on, monsters and also what he did in the story. But assuming that it's probably the world government that was, trying to maybe enact one of their purges, or that was one of their moments where they tried to invade Wano. I'm sure they probably tried to do that plenty of times. Maybe not in the last few hundreds of years if they lost all their dragons, but they were probably after the world government took over, then the Celestial Dragons are like, hey, Wano's that one country that has all these valuable resources and everything, and they're not letting us in. Well, who cares? We have dragons. We can freaking invade. And that would work with pretty much every single other country in the entire world to bring an army of dragons to freaking raise an entire army to the ground and then take over the nation. But in the case with Wano, you got badass samurai. You got Ryuma, okay? So every single dragon they send toward the island either gets turned back or wounded, and then you have Ryuma that just straight up decapitates one in the middle of the freaking flower capital. And that was probably one of the biggest, baddest dragons the world government had. That was like the Drogon, or like the King Dread or whatever of the freaking One Piece world, where there was this is the greatest dragon in history. He can burn an entire island down in a single breath. We will take Wano once and for all. And they fly into the flower capital, and it's freaking the Acnologia music cues up from Fairy Tail, and it's just Skyrim shit or whatever. What was the name of the dragon from Skyrim? I forget. Anyway, this giant dragon shows up, and it's we will take it. And then Ryuma is just takes a big glug of sake because he's Zoro's ancestor, and he's just okay, flies into the air and just shing, and then just slices an entire dragon's head off, and that dragon was the size of a mountain, so that head of that thing is boom, just hits the ground like a freaking, just, the moon dropping, and so just crap, we lost our most powerful dragon, and then at that point onward, the Celestial Dragons were alright, we should probably not mess with Wano anymore. We should probably leave them be. They decapitated one of our largest dragons in a single slice. yeah, okay, it sucks, but we can't invade this place, okay? And so maybe then over the centuries, they lost all their dragons, you know, for various reasons. Maybe God Valley had something to do with that, where they lost their dragons. You know, and so now Wano is like, they're trying to do other diplomatic means, like through Orochi with the CP0, because he's a little bit more, because Orochi even came out and said, like, the whole point of me taking over is I want to ruin this country as much as possible before I die, right? Because what they did to me. And so the CP0 were like, oh, we could take advantage of that. Maybe we can finally gain some power in Wano now. And so that happened much later, though. But yeah, so trying to take Wano by force did not happen because Ryuma existed, okay? But he lived 400 years ago, and then he passed away of an illness, probably some distant ancestor of Zoro, you know, maybe not necessarily like Zoro's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, but maybe like, you know, a distant cousin or an uncle or related in some other tangential way. You know, I would find it more believable if that was actually Kuina's line. Like, maybe Ryuma is Kuina's, like, great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Because Kozaburo Shimosuke, Koshiro Shimosuke, that connects back. You know, in some weird way there. Maybe Zoro could also be related. Because we still don't know the circumstances behind Zoro's birth. Exactly, you know, who his parents were or anything like that. Were his parents living in Shimosuke Village? Because if Zoro's parents were living in Shimosuke Village, then he's probably a Shimosuke, but maybe the name, you know, the names change over the centuries and everything like that. But that's what I'm talking about. Like, something like that might happen. I think in the anime, it was established that Zoro wasn't from Shimosuke, he was from another village, but that's just the anime. In the manga, no, he was raised and grew up and was probably most likely born in Shimosuke Village in the east, okay? So that's Ryuma, and now finally we get into stuff that's kind of happened within the last century. With 55 years ago, we have Kozaburo Shimosuke leaving the land of Wano illegally, because the isolationism is still in play here. He leaves illegally, he travels to the east, he arrives on an island, he defeats some mountain bandits, he, you know, all the people are happy that he's there, he builds the village, and he teaches them swordsmanship and swordsmithing, and he raises an entire village. He calls it Shimosuke Village, named after his namesake from Wano. He has a son named Koshiro, his son has a daughter, Kuina, Zoro's also there, and Zoro, here's the thing, Zoro even mentioned when he was training Momo about the Sonachi thing, like, oh, that's just something an old man in my village used to say whenever he was practicing his sword. And so Momo's like, oh, okay. But that establishes right there, Zoro probably knows Kozaburo. He's probably not dead. This happened 55 years ago, but he might have been in his 20s when he left, or his 30s, even if he was, let's say he was in his 30s. Let's say he was 35 years old when he left 55 years ago. That means he would be 90 now. You know, you could be 90 years old. My grandfather's going to be 99 this year. Brooke is 90. Yo-ho-ho-ho! You know? So he could be this, you know, relatively frail old man, but he could still be alive, and he could be living in Shimosuke Village to this day, and Zoro grew up and trained under him next to Koshiro, right? So there you go, right? Why did he leave? Might have been maybe the same issue with Odin. Like, he's just like, this country is too restrictive. I don't like the isolationism. I'm going to leave. And I got a group together, and he left. He's the one that created the Enma and the Wado Ichimonji. And Tenguyama Hitetsu's the one that created Ame no Habakiri, his masterpiece. So it all connects back to Kozaburo in some way. You know, Zoro has his sword now. Before Kozaburo left, he gave Tenguyama created Ame no Habakiri, but he gave Enma. I like to think they worked on it. Like, that's why I think they're the similar ages. Like, they worked on these blades together, and then when they were both completed, they handed them over to the Kozuki family as a gift. Because Odin, from when the time he was very young, like when he was a kid, he had these swords. You know, that story that Odin, when he like attacked a casino when he was like 7 years old, yeah, he had these swords when he did that. So, right before Kozaburo left, probably, he finished Enma, and then, you know, Tenguyama created Ame no Habakiri. They gave it over to the Kozuki family, and then gave him to Odin, and then he left. And I know that Oda said, like, it's just a side thing, I'm not going to go into great detail, and he already established a lot of this during the SBS, but I kind of want to see an arc of this, or not even an arc, just give us a chapter. It doesn't have to be right now when the battle's going on, but after Wano is over, just have us, like, one chapter where we cut over to Shimosuke Village and see what Koshiro and everybody are doing, and we see Kozaburo walk out of the shadows as an old man with he's using a sword as a cane, you know, he's walking out, and he's like, what's going on out here, Koshiro? he's like, nothing, Dad, go back to bed. All right. I used to be a samurai. Of course you did, Dad. All right. Maybe something like that. That would be cool. But that was 55 years ago. And then finally, we get brought up to the 41 years ago where Odin was 18 years old, slayed a mountain god, and did everything that I referenced at the beginning of this. Actually, wait, no, we have something before that. We have the whole Kurozumi debacle that we haven't even gone into. Okay, see, like, what I mean? Like, Oda does a great job of establishing a lot of stuff happened in the history of Wano. I gave you the backstory 40 years ago. There is boatloads of more stuff before that. So what happened with the Kurozumis was that they were one of the daimyos. I like to think that they were the daimyos of the Kuri region way back in the day, because this was when the Kozuki family was strictly the shogun family, and then you had Shimosuke, Uzuki, Amasuki, Fugetsu, all having the kanji form moon, Getsu, or Suki inside of their names in some way, and then Kurozumi, which means black charcoal, was the fifth daimyo, probably over the Kuri region. Then the Kurozumi that was the daimyo at the time, Orochi's grandfather, decided to wage a coup, poison the shogun and poison the other daimyos and take over the... Well, actually, no. What it was he was going to poison the other daimyos because a successor of the Kozuki clan had not been born yet. So this was probably long before even 55 years ago. This was probably well before. This was when, right before Sukiyaki was born. And Sukiyaki was already, in his 30s during 41 years ago when Odin's flashback began when he was 18, right? So if that's the situation there, yeah, this would have been probably over 60 years ago, okay? So there was no successor of the Kozuki clan born yet. And so it was looking like what they were going to do was they were going to pick a member of the daimyos to become the next shogun. All right? And so Orochi's grandfather was like, oh, okay, well, I'll just poison all the other daimyos. And then, well, I don't know what's happened. I am Orochi's grandfather. I am Pappy Kurozumi. And I don't know what happened. I came into work today and, Daimyo Uzuki, he was dead. And Daimyo Fugetsu, he was dead. And, Daimyo Amasuki, I'm not going to tell you what happened to him, but yeah, he's dead. And Shimosuke, too, they're all dead. And they're like, well, they're all dead. I guess you're going to be the new daimyo. I'm like, oh no, I couldn't possibly. Well, okay. I don't know, that's not gonna put you, implicit in their murders. It's like, all right. Well, it looks like there's not gonna be a successor of the Kozuki family, so we gotta pick one of you 5 daimyos. Next week, 4 of the daimyos are dead. It's like, well, maybe the last survived. Wow, you're really lucky. You didn't die. They all died, and you're the one that's still alive. Wow, that's crazy. I'm like, I know, I'm just fit as a horse. Well, I guess I'll be the shogun now. Sure, that's how it works. And no one's gonna, raise an eyebrow at that. No one's gonna be like, whatever. He gets caught doing it, and on top of that, Sukiyaki was born as kind of like the 11th hour. Right at the last minute, Sukiyaki was born as sort of like a miracle child, and so he became the next shogun, Odin's father. And then they found out about the Kurozumi plot, and so not only did they kick them out of the ruling class, of the daimyo classes, which is why I think Kuri fell into disarray, because they were the daimyos of Kuri, and then Kurozumi was, kicked out, and so what's the term for that? Not defamed, but excommunicated, I guess I'm thinking of. Maybe that's more of a church theme, but I'll go with excommunicated, I guess. So he was disavowed or excommunicated from, the shogunate or from Wano's royalty or the nobles, and so he got kicked out. Kuri fell into disarray, into a lawless zone, which is where Ashura Doji eventually ended up taking over. And so not only was he, forced to commit seppuku, and so his grandfather, Orochi's grandfather, died that way. Basically, the entire Kurozumi family became hunted by everybody in the land of Wano. If you see a Kurozumi, you make a beeline for them, and they, Orochi told these stories where they were, thrown into rivers and kicked off of a cliff and just chased and just killed brutally. And so Orochi, that's, kind of what is the origin for him, that's the reason why he wanted to take over the land, and he collaborated with Higurashi and Semimaru, who are also members of the Kurozumi clan. And then he's just like, I just want to take over this land to ruin it for what they did to me. I still have nightmares of being chased and my mom and my dad being murdered murdered and all of my clan members, like, being thrown over cliffs and things. Like, this is ridiculous. You know, I'm going to become the shogun of this country, and I'm going to ruin everything, and before I die, I'm just gonna, like, basically run this country into the ground. Okay, that was, like, Orochi's plan, you know? I'll live in comfort as long as that goes, but when I'm about to go, screw this. You know, you guys did this to me. Sort of like the vicious circle kind of cycle, and that's also why I think, like, you know, provided Orochi survived, which I guess right now he didn't, but when Momo takes over, it's going to be a very different kind of setup. You know, he's maybe gonna, if Momo takes over as the shogun, he's going to make sure things are a little bit more, not like, oh, okay, everybody that worked for Orochi needs to pay. It's like, well, they need to pay, but maybe not do the whole rampant, you know, like, hunting thing. That was kind of extreme, right? And so that happened, and that continued, you know, years later. That's why Kanjuro was, you know, almost attacked. I think his parents were killed in that manner, and then Kanjuro managed to escape, and then he ended up working for Odin, and so Kanjuro was a spy this whole time. So yeah, the whole thing comes back to the Kurozumis, you know, Orochi's grandfather, and the way he acted. We still don't even know the whole story beyond that, but that would have probably been over 60 years ago, right around the time Sukiyaki was born. So yeah, after that brings us up to current events in the flashback with Orochi's plot, you know, joining Yasuie's group to become, you know, the next, you know, vassal of the Kozuki, and then Odin leaves, and then he takes advantage of this, and then Seimaru and Higurashi use their devil fruit powers to help him take over, become the shogun. Odin comes back, but at that point it's too late. Kaido arrives on the island. You know, it's really insane because all of Wano arc, the arc that we're in right now, focuses so much around Kaido as the main enemy. Kaido does not show up in the story of Wano until, like, the very end of this, like 20-something years, like 25-something years. That's when Kaido finally shows up. You know, it's just like so much stuff happened beforehand. So I just wanted to do a video kind of compiling all that together. And of course, after Odin was executed, we do the time jump, and that brings us up to 20 years later, where the Straw Hats are fighting on Onigashima right now against the Tobiropo, against Kaido himself. Orochi got decapitated. So we'll see what goes from here. But yeah, a lot of crazy stuff going on in Wano, and whenever we get this flashback to the Void Sentry, Wano is going to be a center stage for that, I guarantee you. You know, Oda's going to draw the Void Sentry arc, you know, the flashback whenever they reach the Rio Ponoglyphs or whatever, like Robin's reading off the Rio Ponoglyphs. We cut back into the past of what's going on. Shandor is going to play a role there. Wano's definitely going to have a role there. Alabasta, because of the Nefeltari family. Marie Joie, of course. Maybe the creation of the Red Line, the three ancient weapons, Joy Boy, Poseidon, Pluton, Uranus. All that stuff is going to play a central role there. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be crazy to see a Void Sentry arc focusing on all these islands that we already know about in the present, but what they were like over like 900 years ago, and where the story starts. I was rewatching an episode of Zoe the other day, and I was just thinking, like, oh my god, it would be so funny and adorable if, like, we cut to 1,000 years ago in the Void, like, that's where the Void Sentry arc starts, like 1,000 years ago, and we see little baby Zunisha. We see, like, a Zunisha that's still really big as an infant, like maybe the size of, like, a house, but it's like this cute, adorable little elephant that's just all happy and cheery, of just like, yay, I'm an elephant, everybody loves me. And then cut to 1,000 years later, this giant elephant walking through the ocean, like, is like, forced to walk for all eternity. You know, it's like, oh god. You know, so that we might see that. You know, Oda might draw that. So that'll be really cool to see. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down below what you think about all the past of Wano and how this is going to connect to everything. Yeah, the country of gold, Toki, Ryuma's exploits, the whole Kurozumi plot, what the Kozukis did, the Kitetsu line, Kozaburo. I mean, there's just so much stuff here. The Ponoglyph creation, so much stuff. Thanks for watching. Tekking and Barry. Oh, you're upside down, Clone Barry. How long you been like that? Signing out.